This is Chapter 4 on carbohydrates from the 4th edition of Nutrition for Sport and Exercise. The first couple of learning objectives you've learned in your introductory nutrition classes: to classify carbohydrates according to their chemical composition, describe the digestion and absorption of carbohydrates. But in this course, you'll be able to explain in more depth the metabolism of glucose, how muscle glycogen and blood glucose are used to fuel exercise, and also be able to understand and explain carbohydrate recommendations for athletes, including specific guidelines for intake before, during, and after exercise. In addition, this chapter will help you determine the daily carbohydrate needs of an athlete and help them to be able to select carbohydrate-containing foods to meet the recommended intake. As mentioned, the first part of this chapter is review. Match the element or substances on the left with the correct characteristics on the right. For this slide, fill in the blank with the correct name of the carbohydrate and then check your answers. This slide shows the characteristics of your three monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, and galactose. The sweetness is compared to table sugar. And you'll notice that fructose has the highest sweetness of the three monosaccharides, but it also has the lowest glycemic index. It's much more slowly absorbed through the intestinal tract into the blood sugar. And this can be a benefit in terms of it doesn't raise your blood sugar as quickly. However, when used in sports drinks, it can be a detriment because fructose, because it's not absorbed quickly, kind of lingers in the GI tract and can cause a lot of GI discomfort, gas, bloating, and indigestion. So it's often not recommended for use in sports drinks. Galactose is found only as part of lactose, so that the glycemic index is not known. And glucose has a glycemic index of 100, which is the highest, and all other foods are compared to glucose or white bread, which have the highest glycemic indexes. Note that all monosaccharides eventually turn into glucose in the liver. All three monosaccharides have a ring structure, and although they slightly vary in their ring structure, they all contain the same number of carbons, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules. They each have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. The 3 disaccharides, sucrose, lactose, and maltose, also vary in their sweetness and glycemic index. Lactose has the lowest sweetness as well as glycemic index, and sucrose, although being higher, might not be quite as high as you would expect, since a glycemic index is considered high at 70 or above. There's also some other information given on the slide regarding sources. And note that many adults become lactose intolerant as they age. They lack the enzyme lactase, which breaks lactose apart. So if they consume, for example, milk product that has the lactose broken apart, the relative sweetness is actually going to be a little bit higher because it'll contain the monosaccharides versus the actual lactose. The structure of the disaccharides is shown in this slide, and note that they all contain glucose. Then sucrose also contains fructose, lactose contains galactose, and maltose contains a second unit of glucose. Your 3 polysaccharides, starch and fiber, which are present in your food, and glycogen, which is the way we store glucose, are all made up of primarily glucose, and they're often highly branched, and some are more of a straight chain. This diagram is glycogen, which is a series of glucose molecules linked together in a long, highly branched chain. Carbohydrates can be classified a number of ways: as sugars and starches, simple and complex, minimally processed or high quality versus highly processed, or good versus bad. It's best to not classify carbohydrates as good or bad, but appropriate or inappropriate considering the athlete's goals and general health. To review the digestion, absorption, and transportation of carbohydrates, match the term on the left with the definition on the right. And then you can check your answers. This is a cross-section of the small intestine, and inside the small intestine are villi, which are folds that help to increase the surface area of the small intestine and therefore facilitating the digestion and absorption of the carbohydrates and other nutrients. And you can see within each villi is a capillary and lymphatic system network in which the nutrients are absorbed into, and carbohydrates are water soluble, so they would go into the bloodstream, and fatty acids, which are fat soluble, some of those larger ones would go into the lymphatic system. This is another slide of the digestion of carbohydrates. You can see at the top the polysaccharides, starch, and glycogen is a mistake there. It should be fiber. Glycogen we don't consume. It's the way we store glucose in the body. So you have starch and fiber, and remember, fiber is not digested, but it does pass through the stomach and the small intestine along with the other carbohydrates. Salivary amylase digests the starch from the mouth, and then pancreatic amylase digests it further in the small intestine. And so starch will end up as maltose, which is a disaccharide, and lactose and sucrose pass into the small intestine without being digested at that point. They are not digested by the amylases. Then what happens is on the brush border cells of the small intestine, you have disaccharidases, and those are the enzymes that digest this disaccharides. You have lactase that digests lactose into glucose and galactose. You have maltase that digests maltose into 2 units of glucose. And then you have sucrase, which digests sucrose into glucose and fructose. And then those are the monosaccharides. So once you have the monosaccharides, then they diffuse across the cell into the small intestinal cell, and then they would travel again in the bloodstream, either out to the body in the case of glucose or via the portal vein back to the liver, so the fructose and galactose could be turned into glucose. And note here that you're not responsible for knowing the types of diffusion that each monosaccharide is transported using. So for example, facilitated diffusion, active transport, or simple diffusion. But again, you're not responsible for knowing which one uses which mode of transportation. After the digestion, absorption, and transport of carbohydrates, remember all the carbohydrates will eventually turn into glucose. And then we have the metabolism of glucose in the body. Read the following statements and select the one that is incorrect. Then check your answer. Your blood glucose will rise following the ingestion of carbohydrates, and this stimulates the beta cells of the pancreas to secrete insulin. Insulin then stimulates the cells to take in glucose. It will stimulate the muscle and the liver to store glucose as glycogen. That's if there's sufficient carbohydrate that's been ingested. And it will also stimulate the storage of amino acids and fat. If you don't eat for a couple hours, your blood glucose will fall, and that will stimulate the alpha cells of the pancreas to secrete glucagon. And glucagon has the opposite effect of insulin. It will stimulate the mobilization of amino acids and fat, will stimulate gluconeogenesis, that's the making of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source such as protein, and it will stimulate the liver to release stored glucose, which is called glycogenolysis. And then what occurs is your blood glucose will then rise. So what your body's trying to do is keep that blood sugar within a normal homeostatic range. This diagram shows the blood glucose and insulin response, or what we call the glycemic response, to 50 grams of either unsweetened applesauce in the red or orange juice, which is in the blue. Applesauce has what we call a low glycemic index, and orange juice has a moderate glycemic index. You can see that the orange juice had a much more rapid rise in blood glucose, and then a much larger insulin response, which made the blood glucose drop significantly. The applesauce had a more moderate rise in the blood glucose and more moderate insulin response. And what's important to note here is that sometimes an athlete wants a higher glycemic response. They want to get that sugar up in their bloodstream. And other times they would want, like everyone else, to choose more lower glycemic index foods because it's better for her overall health. And higher glycemic index foods are often those that are more simple, refined carbohydrates, whereas lower glycemic index and lower glycemic response foods tend to be those like beans and whole grains, fibrous fruits and vegetables, and especially when everything is eaten with a mixed meal that has protein and fat in it, it will lower the glycemic index of that meal. So mixed meals are best, and choosing foods lower on the glycemic index scale is often what's recommended. But again, for athletes, sometimes they may want to be choosing foods a little bit higher on the glycemic index that have the higher glycemic response to get their blood sugar up sooner. Read the following statements, and which statement is true about glycemic index? The answer is B. High glycemic index foods cause a rapid rise in blood glucose levels, followed by a rapid rise or response of insulin. As glucose is taken up into a cell, it can be either metabolized or stored for later use, depending on the current energy state of the cell. If stored for later use, the storage would be as glycogen first, and once those stores are full, if carbohydrate or glucose is still available, excess glucose, then that glucose could be turned into fat for later use. When glucose is broken down, it's broken down to pyruvate, and that generates a small amount of ATP or energy, and that then it would either be then converted, the pyruvate would be converted to either lactate with anaerobic metabolism, or it would be oxidized if it continued on through the aerobic metabolic pathways. And if it continues on through the aerobic metabolic pathways, a large amount of ATP and energy will be produced. This diagram is from a very early study done in 1967 on the muscle glycogen utilization during exercise. Subjects rode at a hard aerobic intensity on a cycle ergometer and had their muscle glycogen measured at 15-minute intervals. Subjects repeated the 15-minute intervals until they were too fatigued to continue at the required intensity, which corresponded to a very low muscle glycogen concentration. So this early study showed the effect of intense exercise on depleting muscle glycogen stores. Exercising muscles rely most heavily on muscle glycogen if sufficient stores are available, and that's even if an athlete was taking in glucose. And this was illustrated by a research study done in 1986. And during the research, or the exercise bout, which was of high intensity, when the subjects consumed only a placebo beverage, blood glucose eventually began to fall. And fatigue was associated with a point at which muscle glycogen fell to a very low concentration. When the same group of subjects consumed a carbohydrate drink, that resulted in the maintenance of blood glucose throughout the exercise trial. However, muscle glycogen utilization was no different from that during the placebo trial. And this indicated that there's a preference to use skeletal muscle glycogen even when blood glucose remains high. The stress of higher exercise intensity results in a substantial stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and this leads to a release of two important stress hormones. They're epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline, and it's secreted from the adrenal glands, whereas the majority of the norepinephrine originates from the nerve endings of the sympathetic nervous system. These hormones also stimulate glycogen breakdown, which will produce glucose, and gluconeogenesis, which is the making of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source such as protein, and thus provides an additional mechanism to regulate blood glucose. Another stress hormone, which is released from the body, is cortisol. And what this does is it aids blood glucose regulation too, only it's indirectly by stimulating the breakdown of proteins into amino acids that then may be used for gluconeogenesis again, or the making of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source, which is protein. So both of these, or all of these stress hormones, one of the end results is to raise your blood sugar level so you can run faster, run longer, go harder, lift and train more vigorously. And in a normal setting, when someone's not exercising, if these physiological responses occur, it's not a good thing to have your blood sugar raised if you're not going to also go out and exercise, and which helps to bring that blood sugar back into control. And that's where chronic stress can lead to blood sugar problems, because it raises the blood glucose, but you don't actually go exercise to get that blood glucose back into the cells and used up. So how much carbohydrate should an athlete actually eat? The values in these charts are very widely accepted by most sports nutrition experts. There is some research out there regarding a higher fat, higher protein, or a ketogenic diet. However, again, these values are still holding as the most widely accepted in our field. Low intensity or short duration skill-based activities require approximately 3 to 5 grams per kilogram. Lower intensity but longer duration, 5 to 7 grams per kilogram, and very high intensity, short duration, about 5 to 7 grams per kilogram. Higher intensity, short duration, again 5 to 7 grams per kilogram. High intensity, short duration with some rest periods, 5 to 7. Moderate intensity, moderate duration, 6 to 8. Intermittent, high intensity, moderate to long duration, or more than an hour, 6 to 8 grams per kilogram, or 8 to 10 grams per kilogram during heavy training and competition. For moderate to high intensity or long duration, about 1 to 3 hours per day, anywhere from 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day is recommended. Moderate intensity will ultra long duration, anywhere from 8 up to 12 grams per kilogram per day, and that depends on the stage of training. And then others such as bodybuilding, football, anywhere from 5 to 10 grams per kilogram. And so what these charts show is it depends on the intensity, the duration, and the stage of training and the actual sport as to what the actual carbohydrate recommendations for athletes would be. A general recommendation for athletes to remember then for total carbohydrate intake is 3 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. Again, it depends on the intensity of the exercise, the duration, the stage of training, and the actual exercise or sport itself. The next question is based on the next slide. So I will go ahead and explain it on the next slide. This slide compares two female endurance athletes' intake of carbohydrates, and both took in 70% of their calories as carbohydrate, which is high when you consider the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is 45 to 65% of calories as carbohydrate, and theirs was up and above that. So does that mean that both of their carbohydrate intake was adequate for their sport? Well, if you look back at the charts on the following slides, you would notice that a low-intensity endurance athlete of more than an hour should have anywhere between 5 to 7 grams per kilogram. And if that endurance athlete was training at a moderate to high intensity for 1 to 3 hours, it should be anywhere from 6 to 10 grams per kilogram. So let's take a look at Jennifer. She took in 350 total grams of carbohydrate, and she took in 2,000 calories, which was equivalent of 70% of her calories were carbohydrate. And per gram of body weight, or gram per kilogram body weight, she took in 6.4 grams per kilogram. Liza, on the other hand, also had the 70% of her calories as carbohydrate, but she took in 245 grams at 1,400 calories per day. So the percentage is based on the actual caloric intake. So it can be a little bit deceiving because it appears high if you look at the percentage, but if you look at the actual grams per kilogram, she was at 4.5, which is below the recommended range of either 5 to 7 for low intensity or 6 to 10 for high and moderate intensity. So really important that you don't only look at the percentage of calories as carbohydrate, but you look at the actual grams, the calorie intake to see if she's eating sufficient calories, and also the grams per kilogram body weight. There's many types of products on the market for pre-exercise, post-exercise, during exercise, carbohydrate replacement. And a real common one are carbohydrate or electrolyte replacement drinks or beverages. And those, a key thing with those is they should be around a 6% solution of carbohydrate, 6 to 8%. So it's more dilute than something like orange juice, which is 12 to 14% carbohydrates. So a more dilute solution will be better absorbed, as well as if it has a little bit of sodium in it, and that will facilitate absorption. And best to stay away from fructose, which is absorbed really slowly, so to kind of linger in the GI tract and could cause some stomach upset. The same as if the concentration of carbohydrate was too high in an electrolyte or carbohydrate replacement drink. You just want that dilute solution. Many companies, it appears that the trend is towards a blend of different carbohydrate sources. Some that have a higher glycemic response and will get into your system really quickly, such as having some glucose, sucrose in it, or dextrose, and then having a blend with some almost like starch, short starches that would have a lower glycemic response. I've seen a sweet potato type starch in one product that also has the glucose and dextrose in it. So it has a blend of different carbohydrate sources. And that appears to be the trend. And then some athletes just prefer prior to exercise to just eat a carbohydrate snack and not have a lot of the carbohydrate prepackaged products. So it's really up to the athlete to try to find out what works best for them. And as you see in this chart, different companies will promote their products and have a recommended timing of their products as to how many minutes, before exercise, or if they're promoting their product post-exercise, they'll let you know the grams that are in the product and the timing that's recommended. Recommended carbohydrate intake during exercise to enhance performance. If you look at the chart, the high intensity of a lesser duration, anything under an hour, not really any main recommendation for carbohydrate intake. But once the intensity goes up or the duration gets longer than an hour, the recommendation is generally 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And then an ultra endurance event or a competition that lasts many hours or repeated over several days, the recommendation goes up from that 30 to 60 to about 90 grams per hour. And the assumption for these recommendations of carbohydrate intake during exercise or during training is assuming that the athlete can tolerate that amount. And it's so important that athletes find out what works for them. And they should experiment with different amounts and different types of carbohydrates, different timings before using it in any competition. And the maximal rate of carbohydrate absorption from the GI tract is estimated to be about 60 grams per hour. And if your need approaches or exceeds that amount, such as with an ultra endurance event, it's often then helpful to consume, as we mentioned, the sports beverages that contain that blend or that variety of different sugars. Because some of the sugars, such as glucose, will have a higher glycemic response, and that those that are more starch-like, the amylose, amylopectin, are going to have a slower glycemic response. And then, so the blend of sugars will help that athlete right at the start of their exercise or their competition all the way through. Try to answer the following questions regarding maximizing muscle glycogen stores. And then you can check your answers. Notice that in this slide that they're talking about carbohydrate loading, and we'll discuss that on the next slide. This slide shows a very classic protocol to what we call carbohydrate loading or maximizing muscle glycogen stores. And what an athlete does is 7 days prior to a competition, they will exercise to near exhaustion and then go through a depletion phase of eating minimal carbohydrates and a high-fat, high-protein diet. Then on day 4, when their muscle glycogen stores are depleted, they follow that with a very high carbohydrate intake of around 8 grams per kilogram per day. And what that does is it super compensates the muscle glycogen stores. A normal resting muscle glycogen level is at about 100, 125 millimoles per kilogram, whereas following the high carbohydrate repletion phase, it could almost double that to about 220 millimoles per kilogram. So that just gives them an example of how much higher you could get your muscle glycogen should you follow this protocol. And then day 7 is the day of competition. Some drawbacks are during the depletion phase, individuals will get very irritable, they'll feel very tired, they can experience some hypoglycemia, inability to even train at all, and maybe even sustain some injury if they tried to train. And so those are some negative side effects. And also on that day of competition, when they're ready to start to compete, they're so loaded with muscle glycogen, and with muscle glycogen you store a lot of water. So athletes sometimes might feel kind of stiff and not light and ready to go right at the beginning of their competition if they've followed this protocol. So those are just some of the drawbacks. So the next slide will show how this classic carbohydrate loading protocol has been modified so that some of those side effects don't take place, but yet the athletes can still maximize their muscle glycogen stores. This is the modified protocol of carbohydrate loading. And again, the athlete will exercise a significant amount to deplete their glycogen stores on day 1, and they'll have some moderate exercise, tapering throughout the week, rather than exercising to exhaustion the day 1 through 3 and then having no exercise day 4 to 6. You can see they're tapering down from a 90-minute run to 40-minute run to 20-minute run, and then resting prior to the competition, or in this case, a time trial event. They'll follow a mixed diet days 1 through 3 rather than a really low carb, high fat, high protein diet. And then they supercompensate by following that high carbohydrate diet on day 4, 5, and 6. They just don't deplete as severely on days 1, 2, and 3. And this appears to be giving athletes, it just gives athletes also that ability to maximize their muscle glycogen stores with all of the side effects. And it's been used very successfully and by a lot of different athletes. This is a graph from a classic study that was done in 1971 by a researcher named David Costo. And I want to point out that when you're in the field of sports nutrition or any specialty area, you'll start to become familiar with the top researchers in the field. And in the 1970s, David Costo was one of the top researchers in our field. And a couple of your assignments include videos by Dan Bernadette, and he is nowadays one of the top in the field of sports nutrition. So again, And the more you learn and the more you continue to learn, it's good to look at the research and you'll become familiar with some of these top researchers. So this study was done on distance runners, and they ran 10 miles 3 days in a row, and they ate a normal mixed diet. And through muscle biopsies, it clearly showed the decline in resting muscle glycogen levels each day. In fact, when the runners began their 10-mile run on the third day, they had the lowest muscle glycogen levels than they had much lower than when they finished their first 10-mile run. So it showed that there was that constant depletion of muscle glycogen when the athletes were not consuming enough carbohydrate day in and day out. And therefore, it's so important that athletes continue on a daily basis to consume an adequate number of carbohydrates to replenish that muscle glycogen, or it'll just slowly deplete over time and therefore, again, adversely affect their training and performance. The same thing happens with water. If an athlete or anybody just doesn't drink enough water day in and day out, over the period of a couple, 2, 3, 4 days, the individual will become chronically dehydrated. Even though they're drinking water, they're just not drinking enough. So how do we translate these needs of grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrate into actual food recommendations? Well, to start, this is a chart. It gives different athletes' weight, and then whether you want to recommend 5 grams per kilogram, 6, 7, all the way up to, we said, 12. This chart shows up to 10 grams per kilogram. So it shows the amount of carbohydrates that athlete should have per day based on their body weight. This is a similar slide to the last one with just different weights in the left-hand column. And you can calculate the grams per kilogram on your own. It's just sometimes handy to have a chart like this. The next type of chart that's helpful is to know carbohydrate-rich foods and the amount of carbohydrate each one contains. And you could refer to a chart like this, or if you use the values for carbohydrate counting, then each serving of bread, each serving of milk, each serving of fruit, and each serving of vegetables, they all equal approximately 15 grams of carbohydrate. And so you could just then count servings of each of the high carbohydrate food groups and multiply the number of servings by 15 grams in each serving. And that's actually the simplest way to quickly add up carbohydrates or plan a high carbohydrate meals and a high carbohydrate day versus looking up individual values for each of the foods. Here's the same chart, different foods with all the different grams of carbohydrate in the servings given. But again, if you learn standard serving size, standard portion sizes that go with carbohydrate counting, such as half a cup of oatmeal, third a cup rice, half a cup of pasta, and know that each of those have approximately 15 grams of carbohydrate in them per serving, it makes it a lot easier to plan athletes' meals and to count up the carbohydrates in a typical day that they might record for you to look at. This chart shows carbohydrate containing foods by food group, and it shows the grams of carbohydrate as well as fiber for each of the different foods in each group. And again, if we go through the carbohydrate counting method where we know the serving size that's equivalent to about 15 grams of carbohydrate, then that is a little bit simpler than doing it this way. And I'll go ahead and post sample serving sizes for each of the different food groups that correspond to 15 grams of carbohydrate per serving, and I will post that in your Canvas course. This is for fruit, usually a half a cup of fruit or medium piece is considered a serving, And in carbohydrate counting, they'd all be rounded off to about 15 grams per serving. And here are your vegetables, which are lower in carbohydrates for approximately the same portion size as with your fruit. And then milk, we mentioned about a cup of milk is right around 15 grams of carbohydrate, with the exception of chocolate milk. This slide shows carbohydrate content of sports beverages or electrolyte replacement drinks, such as the top, which has a 6% carbohydrate solution, which is helpful for the actual fluid replacement in the drink. And that has about 15 grams of carbohydrate a cup. The higher carbohydrate sports beverages is going to be more concentrated in carbohydrate because it has a different purpose. It's trying to supply that athlete with a lot more carbohydrate for energy. It's not just for fluid replacement. And then you can see kind of where that soft drink falls. And we have mixed foods with different amounts of carbohydrate. And foods like nuts, they have a little bit of carbohydrate, but they're not a high carbohydrate source. Here's a diet analysis of a 24-hour diet of a male collegiate cross-country runner. His name is Lucas. And Lucas's goals in terms of his energy intake and energy nutrient intake is listed in the chart. And you've learned how to calculate these. For the energy level, you're taking the kilocalories per kilogram per day, such as was in the chart in table 2.5 in chapter 2, where we looked at the kilocalories per kilogram based on the type of intensity of exercise, and you would multiply that value times the athlete's weight in kilograms. For carbohydrate, for an endurance athlete of higher intensity, again, the chart would show around 8 grams per kilogram, so you'd multiply that amount by the athlete's kilogram body weight to get, in this case, 504. For protein, 1.5 grams per kilogram is that of which is recommended for an endurance athlete. And his intake, if you look at it, he met his goals for calories. He also met his goals for intake of carbohydrate. He was over on his protein intake, but he was still within the guidelines for long distance endurance athletes at 2.0 grams per kilogram. So he was okay there. As you know, sometimes athletes will eat so much protein that they're too low in, they eat so much protein and then they're low in carbs, and that wouldn't be good. But in this case, he's adequate in both. And then you kind of fill in the remainder of calories that are needed as fat. And he was a little less than his goal, but still within the guidelines. The other thing you want to look at is what is Lucas actually eating? And in the spotlight in your chapter, it will show his one-day intake that was analyzed. And it showed that he's a little bit low on his vegetables, which is typical for an athlete and for an American athlete in particular. And so you'd want to work on that in terms of upping his vegetable intake. And he was pretty high in his sugary beverages, and so that would be something to also work on, finding a better carbohydrate source than so much of the sodas or sugary beverages. So looking at the actual foods the athlete is eating, not just what the values of the diet analysis show. The other thing to look at is timing. You want to make sure that the carbohydrate is spread throughout the day, that it's not just consumed, for example, all at dinner. And it should be consumed breakfast and then pre-exercise, and then post-exercise is important to replenish the muscle glycogen stores. And the same with protein. It's good to have protein at your meals throughout the day to keep your blood sugar more stable. And again, after exercise, it's good to help with rebuilding the muscle tissue. So the timing and actually what the athlete is eating is very important, but a place to start is, are they meeting their energy and energy nutrient requirements? When we look at carbohydrate intake, we also have to look at really practical issues for the athletes. And here are carbohydrate containing foods as well as storage and preparation tips that you could give an athlete. Would also be great to give them tips on carbohydrate-rich restaurant choices. Sugar recommendations are typically stated as less than 5 to 10% of total calories, and that's simple sugars. But we also want to caution against the overuse of artificial sweeteners because we really don't know the long-term safety of them, and they're in a variety of different foods, and athletes can get away with some simpler carbohydrates in their diet, so probably best to avoid. Stevia is the only one that's more natural, coming from a chicory root plant, and that has a very sweet taste if you use a little bit of it, let's say in a beverage, and you don't use much, and it has, doesn't affect the blood glucose or insulin levels as pure sugar would. It's also important to mention, and your book points this out, the use of sugar alcohols, and those are substances such as sorbitol, maltitol, xylitol, and what they are is they're sugar alcohols, and they do provide some calories per gram, but they're absorbed really slowly, so they don't cause the rapid spike in blood glucose, and that's why they're often used. But what happens with an athlete and in any individual, if you consume too much of them, like for example, if they're in energy bars, let's say they're in a lower carb energy bar, they're not digested very rapidly, and the sugar alcohol is absorbed very slowly, so it's similar to sucrose, where it can kind of linger in the GI tract and cause a lot of discomfort. They used to only put sugar alcohols in gums and hard candies to help prevent dental caries, but then they started putting it in things like bagels and energy bars. And again, if you eat an energy bar and it causes your stomach to be upset, you can look at the label and see if it has one of those sugar alcohols in it. And it's really best for athletes to avoid those sugar alcohols. It causes a lot of GI upset. The prior slide came from the position paper on the use of nutritive and non-nutritive sweeteners from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. GI upset is actually pretty common among athletes, particularly among endurance athletes such as runners. And we mentioned fructose and sugar alcohols as being a potential cause because of the fact that they're absorbed very slowly from the GI tract, and so then can cause gas, bloating, and stomach discomfort. Other issues that can occur are lactose intolerance, fermentable carbohydrates that are not digested well, and gluten or gluten intolerance. So go ahead and try to fill in the blanks and then check your answers. And the term that you might not be familiar with is a FODMAP, which is the acronym for fermentable oligo, di, and monosaccharides and polyols. And FODMAP foods are short-chain carbohydrates that can cause GI upset due to poor absorption. So it draws the water into the GI tract, and then some rapid fermentation by bacteria will occur, and that can cause the gas, the bloating, the cramping, diarrhea. These symptoms are really similar to anybody who has irritable bowel syndrome. So a doctor, a physician, dietitian would work together to try to help determine whether or not the athlete might have IBS or whether or not they should try a FODMAP diet. And if so, they should definitely work under the supervision of a dietitian, because there's very nutritious foods that are recommended then to be eliminated. So to make sure that the athlete's still getting the nutrients that it needs, they should definitely work with a dietitian. And the same goes with gluten intolerance. Some athletes, a very small percentage, actually have celiac disease, which is a disease in which the body cannot tolerate gluten. The person would actually be allergic to gluten, and it can cause the small intestine to become damaged and become chronically inflamed so that nutrients are not being absorbed. Other athletes and individuals don't have that full-blown celiac, but they just don't tolerate gluten very well. And they feel much better when they remove gluten. And gluten is found in wheat, barley, and rye. And it's also found in small amounts in a variety of different foods. So again, good to work with a dietitian to learn, or dietetic technician to learn the different sources of gluten. And there's a whole continuum of gluten tolerance. So there's some people that can't handle just a tiny bit, and other people that can handle a little bit but not too much. In summary, carbohydrates are the primary energy source for moderate to intense exercise. And since we know exercise reduces muscle glycogen stores as well as liver glycogen stores, they must be replenished on a daily basis. The general recommendation for carbohydrate intake for athletes in training is anywhere from 3 to 12 grams per kilogram body weight. It depends on the intensity, the duration, and the type of exercise. We talked about carbohydrate loading as being one technique that endurance athletes often use, and even some bodybuilders that use before an important competition. And in carbohydrate loading, that you will go through a period of tapering off on carbs and tapering off on training. And then the last 3 days before the event, you would carbohydrate load. You'd taking a large amount of carbohydrate each day to maximize those glycogen stores. Sufficient carbohydrate intake is an important element in athletic training and competition. And there are proponents of a ketogenic type diet, which is a higher fat, higher protein intake. However, the general recommendations from dietitians and professionals in the field still tend to be toward the high carbohydrate intake for performance. Some athletes have lactose intolerance, reactive hypoglycemia, or diabetes, and these conditions definitely influence the choice of carbohydrate-containing foods. Proper carbohydrate intake will positively affect training, recovery, performance, and overall health.